All right. Well, we have a lot of content to get through tonight, so I'm just going to start talking. You've made it to Walla Walla Speaks, which is kind of a monthly gathering that some of us here at Pioneer United Methodist Church have put together with the help of our friends at the city of Walla Walla, led by Zidane Gallant-Laporte, a senior at Whitman College who is currently serving as the community fellow for the neighborhood engagement program at the city. And this is Zidane. You want to say hi, Zidane?
Hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Zidane, and super happy to be here tonight with our wonderful guest speakers.
Yes, we are so thrilled. So let's welcome our speakers for tonight. The first is Abigail Scholar. She's the Executive Director of Central Washington Justice for Our Neighbors. She's been an integral part of the Walla Walla, Spokane, and Tri-Cities Immigrant Rights Coalitions, as well as the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network. And Aaron Bobrow-Strain. He's a professor and the Baker Ferguson Chair of Politics and Leadership at Whitman College, where he teaches courses on food, immigration, and the U.S.-Mexico border. And he's a founding member of the Walla Walla Immigrant Rights Coalition. We are so pleased and grateful to have these two thinkers, leaders, advocates here with us tonight, and we look forward to learning from them. And because there is so much to talk about, and we've only got an hour, I'm going to turn you over to them now. If we've got a little bit of time at the end, we're hoping we've got 10 or 15 minutes, we'll do some Q&A. So if you've got questions bubbling up, jot them down. You can send them to us in the chat feature, which is down there at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screens. And if there are questions that go unanswered, we will find a way to get Abigail and Aaron's take on those questions. We'll post them with the recording of this video, which will go up on our Facebook page, as well as our website at pioneerww.org/WWS for Walla Walla Speaks. All right, so I'm going to turn you over to our speakers. Friends, welcome.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. It's great to have a bunch of folks out there, and it's really moving to be here today talking about the Walla Walla Immigrant Rights Coalition in the wake of last week's election. Walla Walla Immigrant Rights Coalition was formed amidst the fear and the smoke and the confusion in the aftermath of Trump's election. And it has been a long 4 years. And there had been conversations brewing for a month or so about forming a local immigrant rights group. The real spark that made it happen was the town hall meeting in the library, in the public library, about immigration enforcement, where city officials, the sheriff, the police chief were there. And it was clear that they did not understand immigration law or local law enforcement's role in it, or the dangers of getting local law enforcement tangled up in the business of deporting community members. And we knew that the community was going to have to stand up for itself and was going to have to do the work of defending itself and making sure people understood that immigration and immigrants make Walla Walla strong and vibrant and rich. And we have been going ever since. And there's a core group of maybe about 20 or so folks who are very active, and then up to more than 300 who will show up for events. And we have done a lot. We have stood with immigrant community members in county courts, in ICE check-ins, in asylum hearings, in the darkness of immigration detention. We have reached thousands of immigrants and their allies with Know Your Rights presentations. We've organized rallies, hand-delivered hundreds of letters to representatives, and joined a national outcry for Daca and against family separation. We've connected vulnerable community members to legal assistance, helped stamp out harmful ICE rumors, and staffed an immigration emergency hotline, one of the very first in the whole state, 24/7 for more than 3 years. We have borne witness to deportations out of the Yakima airport. We've created moving art exhibits and oral history and theater works that opened hearts and minds around immigration, and developed that powerful message that this is an immigrant-made and immigrant-welcoming community. As the COVID crisis deepened, we increasingly transformed a social service organization into a social service organization helping to channel much-needed resources to Walla Walla's most vulnerable immigrants. And we're going to keep going. We are super excited about this election. It's a giant victory. It was powered in large part by Black and brown activists who showed up to work for change and folks who voted in record numbers. And it comes after 4 years of having stood up to the most racist and cruel immigration policies in living memory. There is still a lot unclear about this election and what it means, who voted and why they voted and what they voted for. But one thing is clear. It was a full repudiation of Trump's immigration policies. This is one place where the electorate was clear. Trump's #1 most important campaign issue of 2016, immigration, was dead in the water in 2020. And we have seen over the past 4 years a marked shift in public opinion to be more pro-immigrant, pro-asylum seeker, pro-legalization of undocumented community members, anti-immigration detention. And for the first time, actually, since Gallup started asking back in 1964, the majority of people in the United States favor more immigration, not less immigration right now. But the road is not easy ahead, even with the Biden administration. It's not easy at all. And we're going to talk tonight about the challenges that lie ahead. And Abby is going to take over and talk about the local and state work that has been done and that needs to continue to be doing and will happen into the future. And then I'll take over and I'll talk about the national policy side and what the various prospects and challenges and opportunities for different kinds of immigration reform and undoing some of the harm that Trump has created over the next 4 years. So, Abby?
Thanks, Aaron. For those of you who don't know what Central Washington Justice for Our Neighbors is, I'll just give you a quick overview. We're a pro bono immigration legal services organization, and we also do a great deal of advocacy work. So on the one hand, we have the pro bono services, and then on the other is everything that Aaron was just talking about and then some. So we do a lot of work with the ACLU. We've helped out with drafting legislation, which I'll get into a little bit, with the Keep Washington Working Act and the Courts Open to All Act. Those mean, they may mean nothing to you right now, but hopefully in a few minutes they will. But I guess, you know, CWJ Fund, which is the easiest way to shorten our name, so I'll just refer to us as that, really came up out of that same desire and thrust after the last election cycle. There are a number of other JFON sites nationally that have been around for quite some time. But here in Central Washington, it was really the past election cycle when Trump was elected that kickstarted things. And I think it's really important for everyone to always remember that when we talk about immigration on a national scale, there's something very different about Central and Eastern Washington that people just don't know unless they're involved with the community. And Central and Eastern Washington have been really ignored and left to flounder on their own as a community, varied communities, because they're not a monolithic community, but all of our undocumented community members or varied status community members have gone without sufficient legal representation because there are very few pro bono or low bono services available. And very little financial resources have come to Central and Eastern Washington to help develop organizations that are focused on varied status and undocumented community members. So really, it's only been, I would say, in the past 4 years or so that we've seen some major shifts in those trends in particular. And it's important. And the way we can sort of see that marked trend is to talk about something that's going on right now, which ties into COVID. It ties into how our communities are left behind and the needs that people have. So right now, we're in the process, CWJFON work along with other partner organizations in assisting with the dispersal of what's being called the Worker Immigrant Relief Fund. And that began as an ask for $100 million. We asked the governor's office for $100 million to provide an undocumented unemployment fund. And we got a yes, but not for 100 million. We got a yes for 40 million. And that sounds like a huge number, you know? So nobody's going to stick their nose up in the air at $40 million. But we're only 2 weeks into the application process, and there are already, I believe, 60,000 applications. So the applications have well surpassed the need. And I think one of the things, to bring it back to Central and Eastern Washington, that's really significant is that in the first week of applications, I believe there were 17,000 applications. It's obviously jumped quite a bit since then. But out of those 17,000 applications, a majority of those applications came from Central and Eastern Washington, which was a first. And I would say that that's in large part due to the fact that we have organizations and grassroots groups such as WORK, CWJFON, Yakima Rapid Response, WISN, which is the Washington Immigrant Solidarity Network, that have been doing work on the ground for 4 years and getting to know community and really being led by an impacted community. So, you know, WORK in its leadership team has a majority of impacted community members on that steering committee, I believe. The same goes for Central Washington Justice for Our Neighbors, and all of the other organizations I've mentioned. So I think those are really important key points for us to remember whenever we talk about immigration. If we're here in Walla Walla, let's really think about what that means for us and our communities here, because it's very different than in other places. So as you can tell, I ramble a little bit. That's kind of my style. I'll try and bring it back a little bit to what I think Erin and I had talked about me focusing on, which is the local sort of really regionally specific path forward. What we're doing now and the path forward, which I think also means looking back a little bit, because looking back means looking back a year. So last year, there was a law passed in Washington state called the Keep Washington Working Act. And a lot of us, 2 of us specifically on this call, were part of those conversations, which helped lead to the passage of that law. And basically that law goes straight back to what Erin was talking about, which deals with the relationship between local law enforcement and ICE, Immigration, Customs and Enforcement, and CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, and how the entanglement of those entities works to the detriment of our communities writ large. It doesn't just damage families that are varied status or undocumented, that it actually like cuts to the core of all of our communities. We live in an agricultural area. Who is it that picks our grapes? Who is it that picks our apples? Who is it that's working at the grocery store when we're all locked in our homes and go get groceries? I mean, it impacts all of us to some degree, some more than others. So with the passage of that law, there was a period where there's sort of like this sad, weird grace period after a law is enacted, where law enforcement and whomever is in charge has the opportunity to sort of pull themselves together and say, okay, we're gonna do all of these changes and follow that law. Or they can sit back and wait for the policies to be put out from the state attorney general's office and whomever else is involved, and then apply those policies and protocols to their systems. What we also were able to help pass is a really incredible law, which is sort of shortened to COTA, C-O-T-A, Courts Open to All. And that in itself can also really be brought back to Walla Walla, because the Courts Open to All Act, which was just passed this year, so won't go really into effect until next year because of that grace period, has to do with access to justice. And Walla Walla, WORK, CWJFON, but primarily WORK, really started this beautiful program of what you may have heard of, which is called accompaniment. And accompaniment services really are just that. If somebody has to go to the courthouse to deal with a ticket they need to pay for, and they're too afraid to go because they don't know if ICE or CBP are going to be at the courthouse, they can call the hotline at work, Wyson, CWJFON, and we'll get groups together to go with them. The fear of going to a courthouse, accessing justice, is so deeply enmeshed in these communities that we have, and like numbers of cases that we've actually worked with where people are afraid to go get orders of protection when they're in abusive situations, because they're afraid of being picked up by ICE. They're afraid to go testify on behalf of other community members. You know, God forbid I'm robbed and somebody witnesses it and they happen to be undocumented. If there's nothing in place to protect them, what's the incentive for them to come to court and testify when we've seen so many arrests and detentions at courthouses? I would highly recommend you look up at Grant County and their record for how often our community members are taken into custody without judicial warrants, without appropriate warrants. And you'll see that these fears are really well founded. So the Courts Open to All Act really has been put in place to create equal access to justice for everyone within our communities. And I think it's really important for us to all sort of digest that it had to be pushed into law. These two things, Keep Washington Working and Courts Open to All, had to be fights for the most basic rights for community members. And it's just not stuff that you think about unless you have to think about it. And I want to say that's a tragedy, but it isn't necessarily. You know, we all work in different fields and have different things that we focus on in our lives. Erin and I just happen to be part of these communities for various reasons. I'm an immigrant myself. I grew up in an immigrant family in Canada where English was rarely spoken. So for me, my relationship to community is very specific and very personal. So I really can't imagine not thinking about it, because I do think about it every day, but it makes sense that others wouldn't. So in terms of what we have, what I would like for everyone to think about moving forward is specifically looking at the Worker Immigrant Relief Fund, which is a temporary fund, $40 million. We all already know it's not going to cover everyone. It's barely going to cover the people who have applied. What we're now working on is we're working on legislation to create a permanent undocumented unemployment fund. It doesn't have a working name yet, but One America is involved in that process. CWJ Fund's involved in that process. Work will soon be deeply involved in that process, I'm sure. And Wyson is involved in that process too, because we're all in a time of crisis. We're all sitting here on Zoom. Some of us are lucky enough that we're able to work from home, and we were able to receive some small assistance through the CARES Act, but that's not the case for most people. We just look at the statistics, our unemployment rates. And if you think about those numbers of applicants for the WORF funding, think about our agricultural workers, our domestic workers, all of our workers in Central and Eastern Washington who weren't helped out by the CARES Act, who have nowhere to go. They've been paying into unemployment their entire working careers, and there was nothing there for them when they needed help most. And they're just as impacted as we are, if not more so. So what I would like for us to do really is to focus our energy on ensuring that there is a long-term solution, because we can do that in Washington. Washington's really progressive. We can get that past the finish line, I think, quite easily. And I also think really ensuring that you get as involved as you can in local organizations that are trying to do this work, because as Erin said, we've had this hotline going since early 2017, late 2016, and there is only a handful of people that man that hotline 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So if you have abilities in Spanish, please, like, talk to Aaron, talk to me, get involved, because the more people we have supporting the process and learning about what's happening around you, the better off we're all going to be. So those are the sort of things that are sort of mulling around in my brain while I'm also watching what's happening in DC and sort of terrified, and then dreaming about what I would say if I were in a room with Biden and my asks of Biden for executive orders. But yeah, I think that's really where I'm at in terms of where the focus needs to be. But I'd love to ask Aaron to join me again in this conversation to see if there are other things that he's thinking about. He and I dialogue quite well. So I would like to invite Aaron back into the talking space with me.
Okay, well, I mean, that was really good. And it's just a real honor to have worked with you over these past few years on this stuff. So I feel like I learned so much from you every time we're together. And just to echo what you said at the end there is that, like, work, you know, it's really the one immigrant rights organization in town. And so we built it as a big tent. And as you can tell from even that brief list of things that I rattled off at the beginning of what we've done, there's ways that people with lots of different skills can get involved, because we're doing work on so many different fronts, as this work has to be done on many fronts. And so if you are interested, give a shout out, and we can connect you with opportunities to volunteer, and there will be more. And I'm going to talk a little bit jumping scales now, in terms of thinking about, there's a ton of questions and anticipation and maybe even excitement about possibilities and what's going to happen in this new administration around immigration. I'm going to get to some things that I think are going to be really important. But I first want to focus on, I want to get 3 reasons why this is going to be really hard, much harder than we think, and that we can't just think, oh, well, we elected a Democratic president, this is going to be fine. And the first reason is bandwidth. And immigration was a big issue for Biden at the beginning of the campaign. By the end of the campaign, immigration had pretty much disappeared from his campaign. You know, he did some important things. He publicly apologized for some of the worst Obama-era immigration policies that he was involved in. He came up with a really ambitious immigration platform. Harris has a real commitment to immigration reform, and I think can really be pushed. But immigration mostly disappeared in the last stretch of the election. It was not mentioned at all in the victory speeches. And as of when I checked yesterday, it was not on the transition team's priority website. So, you know, Biden has to think about COVID, the economy, there's limited bandwidth. So those of us who care about immigration, who care about asylum seekers, who care about our undocumented neighbors and the border, have to fight to make sure that it is on the agenda. That's the first thing. The second thing is about scale. And that is that while immigration is at best kind of a second-tier priority for Biden at this point, it was Trump's #1 priority for 4 years, and his administration poured massive amounts of institutional resources into major transformations of the legal immigration system. More than 400 executive orders, countless rule changes. There was a methodical deconstruction of the asylum system, an effort to gum up and bring to a screaming halt most of the processes through which people become legal immigrants in this country, curtailing all kinds of humanitarian protections. It was a very deliberately planned and well-executed assault on legal immigration. And the Trump team did it in a very sophisticated way, making sure that those policies are interlocking and often hard to undo. So there's that we're up against. I don't
Aaron, can I just also point something out that I think is interesting in terms of what you're talking about the 2 trajectories, right? One of the really fascinating things that we were doing all the way up until the election was our immigration attorney really drew up two plans for what is it going to look like if Trump wins, and what's the work going to look like if Biden wins. And both equations equaled triple, if not quadruple, the amount of work we're looking at right now. So I think everything you're saying is so clear and on point, because there's so much to do and undo in the positive and the negative. So I'm sorry to have interrupted.
And if you ask, Wendy Hernandez, a local immigration attorney here in Walla Walla, she can tell you stories about how effectively the immigration system has been gummed up and brought to a halt. The part of the immigration system that administers visas and other immigration benefits, citizenship, has been brought to a grinding halt. It's in financial collapse right now. The third thing is just the political reality that Biden is facing a divided Congress and a Trump judiciary. When Biden policies are challenged in court, which they will increasingly be heard by Trump appointees at the district level. And I just want to say that this is my personal view. I do not think that a major sweeping comprehensive immigration reform is going to happen. And I'm actually going to argue that that's not a bad thing necessarily. So that's three things why we're going to have to work really hard. But in fact, the situation is not all grim. First, I want to point out that Trump's actions on immigration, sweeping as they were all conducted through administrative or executive actions. There is not a single major legislative victory on immigration in the Trump administration, which means that it can all, in theory, be reversed or canceled. Some it'll take a lot of work to do that. Others it will be very easy, or it could be very easy to do that. The second thing that's a positive here is that every single major court ruling on immigration during the Trump administration upheld the doctrine of plenary power, giving huge deference and leeway to the president on immigration matters. Even rulings that struck down Trump immigration policies did so in a way that acknowledged the president's power to take big executive actions on immigration. So that's, we can argue about whether giving that much power to the president around immigration is good or bad, but there are definitely opportunities here if we push. The third thing is that we have had 4 years of mass mobilization and movement building, and this is not going away. And it is led by immigrants and the children of immigrants, and it is more sophisticated than ever before. And I think, personally, I believe, let's see what Abby thinks about this, I believe it's winning the cultural war over how the US views immigrants. That immigration is good for the country, that undocumented immigrants are members and makers of their communities. So we have force here. And then the last kind of, I think, positive thing as we go into the next administration is that we are better situated because we learned a big lesson during the Obama administration. When Obama took office, the immigrant rights movement gave him a lot of leeway, a lot of space to enact major crackdowns on immigration in the hope that he would be able to leverage kind of a tough on immigration stance to win bipartisan victories and deliver major immigration reform down the line. And we learned that strategy was an absolute abject failure. During his first administration, Obama cranked up the biggest deportation machine in US history at huge cost to the health and well-being of our communities, and he won nothing or virtually nothing in return, zero. By the second term, he had eased up on that crackdown significantly, and we saw Daca emerge, but the cost was too high. And so we've learned our lesson, that we cannot give that leeway early on and hope that eventually, if Biden and Harris are tough and they compromise enough, someday that's going to pay off. We tried that once. We can't do it again. We need from the starting gate to be pushing and making sure they know which direction to go. So what are we looking at specifically? Biden made a ton of promises and commitments. laid out a really ambitious immigration roadmap even for his first 100 days. He's already backtracked off of some of it. Again, we need to push. But what are we likely to see? What do we need to be prepared to fight for? Let me divide this up into a couple categories. The first are the things that are easy. And I would call these the must-see things, right? If we don't see these literally on day one of the Biden administration, we need to pick up the fight. We're talking about canceling the Muslim travel ban, which can be done with the stroke of a pen, day one. Reinstating Daca, which will allow the 400,000 people who are eligible and qualified to apply, but couldn't under Trump, to do that, to apply. That's easy. We need a new interior enforcement memo that gives ICE instructions about who to prioritize for enforcement and deportation. And Biden promised early on in the campaign that this would come in the form of a temporary moratorium on deportation. Let's hold him to that. He's backtracked on that a bit. Let's hold him to that. That said, many groups many immigrant groups that I've been reading about and connecting with would also settle for a return to the late Obama administration enforcement guidelines that at least deprioritized about 85% of undocumented people for enforcement. Either of those routes, moratorium or old Obama policies, is going to create a hellstorm in the ranks of ICE. Because ICE officials have gotten used to the level of impunity that they have under the Trump administration, and they're going to resist these new guidelines, so we need to be able to defend that. Fourth, we need to get the ball rolling on reversing Trump's public charge bill. This is totally doable. It'll take a little longer than some of those other things. We need to end the February 2019 emergency declaration on the US-Mexico border. That's easy, and that would mean no new money pilfered from Department of Defense and other agencies to use for wall construction. Possibly let Department of Defense take back some of the money that was pilfered for border wall construction. And finally, on the short-term things, we need to immediately cancel contracts for building the border wall that are underway right now, particularly on the incredibly ecologically fragile and sacred Autumn lands and Organ Pipe National Park in Arizona. The government can cancel those contracts. They can do it. Biden has promised to construct no new border walls. If we can keep him to that promise, he will be the first president since Ronald Reagan to construct no new border walls. So there's our challenge. Hold him to that promise. In the medium term, the most important thing will probably be rebuilding the asylum system that has been carefully dismantled by Trump, and it's going to be very tricky. A first step will be repealing the so-called migrant protection protocols or Remain in Mexico program. This is a program that has forced 67,000 asylum seekers to wait in dangerous conditions in Mexico, cut off from legal aid while their backlogged asylum cases go forward through the system. Biden can do this with the stroke of the pen, but he's going to be hesitant. Why? Because we need systems in place to process and handle thousands of people suddenly now pursuing asylum cases in the United States. So we're going to look at surging asylum officers to the border instead of sending troops. There's going to be a lot of need for infrastructure for these folks, and community groups and churches can play a role in this. An even trickier piece of this is the most effective thing that Trump did to destroy the asylum system was the March 2020 Center for Disease, the CDC order that allowed a summary expulsion of asylum seekers and unaccompanied minors without a hearing or even the right to make a legal asylum claim at the border. And did this in the name of public health, and this has resulted in more than 200,000 expulsions since March. You know, the courts kept blocking Trump's effort to dismantle the asylum system in different ways, but he was finally more or less able to do it through the back door by calling it an anti-COVID measure. But it's going to be really tricky to undo this politically. Biden has promised to review the order, but nothing more. and he can't be seen as being soft on COVID. So we need to make sure that everybody knows that this CDC rule was not a public health measure. It was a sneaky assault on asylum, right? But even if we get that message out, it's going to be tricky. There's a lot of evidence that the migrant protection protocols and the CDC order have been really effective at slowing flows of asylum seekers from Central America. And there's a real danger that if Biden were to swiftly end those Trump-era programs, horrific policies, as we want him to do, it could backfire by creating a rush of new asylum seekers to the border that would create the appearance of a huge, scary crisis that could result in calls for harsh, cruel policies, calls to secure the border again. So we need to push him to get rid of those policies, but we know it has to be done carefully with lots of infrastructure in place to process asylum claims swiftly. The third thing is the Refugee Program. We're at the lowest level of refugee admissions since the program began in the United States. Biden proposes to raise the number of refugees admitted to the United States almost 10 times to 125,000 refugees. And this is going to require a lot of rebuilding of the infrastructure in communities to resettle refugees. And this is another place where community groups, churches might be able to help. We need a new attorney general who will start reversing rulings made by Sessions and Barr that made it, for example, harder for people to win immigration protection who are the victims of domestic violence. Longer term vision. This is maybe controversial, but I think we just have to acknowledge that a comprehensive immigration bill is not possible and not even advisable. They take huge amounts of time and energy. And they're easily filled with poison pills and giveaways, and they never pass. We've seen this for decades. And honestly, the last two sweeping comprehensive immigration reforms that we passed, 1924, 1964, that gives you a sense of how hard it is to pass them, were terrible for immigrants in a lot of ways. So instead, we actually need to take a page from the Trump and Stephen Miller playbook and start going relentlessly at the immigration system piece by manageable piece. Part of that is going to be a dramatic, in the shorter, long term, a dramatic expansion of Daca to include not just those kind of high achieving, perfect young folks, but also the parents of undocumented kids as proposed by Obama. Also, undocumented people who are married to US citizens, but prevented from ever getting legal residency because of our arcane and brutal immigration system. And also, maybe especially, expanding Daca to include essential pandemic workers, including farm workers. Daca is not a pathway to legal status or citizenship, but it is a huge protection for people. And it can be a stepping stone, I think, transitioning to a real path to legal status and citizenship on down the line. We also need to start picking away at laws that date back to the 1990s and Clinton that have criminalized the act of seeking a better life in the United States and fleeing from violence. Repealing detention bed quotas, mandatory detention laws that give officials no choice other than to lock people up who aren't a flight risk or a threat to their community. Repealing expedited removal, which gives low-level Border Patrol agents the right to act as judge, jury, and executioner in hasty speed immigration proceedings in which immigrants have no right to legal counsel, no right to a hearing in front of a judge, no right to appeal. And then finally, changing our relationship to Central America and Mexico. And that is, crucially is also about de-escalating the war on drugs and support for undemocratic governments, for example, in Honduras, that has been driving most migration to the United States at this point on the southern border. So there's a lot more, but I think this is a few things to get us started as we move into the Biden administration.
I love how digestible that was, Aaron.
Well, Well, friends, let's take just a minute if Abigail and Erin are ready for Q&A. So let's take just a minute. We'll be gathering our thoughts, and you can start sending us some questions via the chat feature at the bottom of your screens there. And just give me one moment to gather up a couple of questions that we've already received. Josh asked a question here a little while ago. It was about payroll protection. I think that's what you mean, Josh. So he's asking Abigail and Erin, what's your perspective on payroll protection for workers, if they're documented or not?
Abby?
I don't really know how to answer that question. It can, like, in what kind of context do you mean? Because our organization, was able to get the payroll protection when it came out. And we do have varied status staff members, but I'm not sure what the sort of context or framework is around the question. So I don't know if I can answer it accurately.
Well, Josh just came back and clarified for me, which he means the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He means what he said. So, okay, so talk to me about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And
that's an Erin answer.
And Josh, I'm afraid I don't have I don't know much about that or what role that plays in this. So I'm sorry. Can't help with that question, unfortunately.
Okay.
That was a good volley between us. I like that.
So you know what, Josh? Actually, this is a great example of a question that we might take and consider more off screen. So keep your eyes peeled for an answer from Abby and Erin when we post the recording of this. We'll think a little more about that, and we'll come up with an answer for you. Okay, from Victoria. In addition to volunteering with work and, for example, supporting the Immigrant Relief Fund applications, what other actions can individuals take to support our community members now? And I know that Abby mentioned that if you're bilingual, taking phone calls is a wonderful way to support this work. What else can they do, Erin and Abby?
So until very recently, CWJ-FON had been doing what we were calling Walla Walla Mutual Aid Network, which was providing direct financial support through prepaid credit cards and prepaid grocery cards straight out to community members. And all of those resources came from individual donors and private foundations. And individual donors gave over $17,000. And we were able to help close to 1,200 local families. At the moment, we actually had to stop because we ran out of resources, but we're waiting to hear back on some larger grants to see if we can kickstart that program again. But there are, and I have to also thank the Walla Walla Immigrant Rights Coalition, because not only did they donate to Walla Walla Mutual Aid, but they also helped us disperse those resources through the social services team. So although CWJ-FON hasn't yet restarted doing the mutual aid network here, there is a mutual aid network in the Tri-Cities. They're right nearby. You can help by doing that. You can check in with you can check in with BMAC. A lot of families go to BMAC to get food support and assistance. You could also reach out to Valle Lindo and see what kind of support's needed there. Maybe you could volunteer, even putting packets together. I know that Maria La Rosas was putting together all these amazing packets for kids that were going to be at home because they couldn't go to school. So there are lots of bits and bobs that you can do here and there, and feel free to reach out to Erin or to myself, and we can link you up. You can help at CWJ-FON with translation services. Sometimes we might just need some documents translated that we can throw up on our website or send out to people, or you could be an interpreter. You go through the process and become one of our interpreters. So there are lots of little places you can jump in.
Let me take some more on that too. And I just wanted to shout out to Victoria. Thank you so much. I know that you were one of the volunteers who came out to help with the Washington Immigrant Relief Fund promotion activity in Walla Walla, and we really appreciate that. The volunteers have been making a huge difference. One of the things that we're seeing as a challenge as people are trying to apply for this benefit is just the folks out there who are not tech savvy, navigating the online process of applying. So we've had a lot of great Whitman students who have come out to help. Victoria, you, many other folks have come out to help. There's going to be more. If you want to come out to help people get that, apply for that benefit, there's ways to help. You don't have to be a Spanish speaker. It's helpful. In fact, I just got an email from our field campaign person who's doing that work right now, and she said, please, we need more Whitman students. So a bunch of Whitman students on this event. So there you go. Reach out to me or Abby. That's something that can happen. I also, if folks are interested, we are looking to expand the work of outreach for the Washington Immigrant Relief Fund to also include other kinds of services that would be needed and that maybe undocumented folks might have difficulty accessing, or folks in the immigrant community might have difficult accessing, such as COVID testing. If anyone wants to help put together a Washington Immigrant Relief /COVID hub where we could get people applying for relief and also tested for COVID and other kinds of information, for example, about the rental assistance program that's out there. If folks are interested and have energy for that work, we can put you to work doing that. Please reach out.
And I think that ties in, actually, the last thing you said to a question that Maria Remington asked about having these workshops in Spanish. And so these conversations that we're having at Pioneer United Methodist and with the Neighborhood Engagement Program, Maria, are wildly diverse, and it would be wonderful to have them all in Spanish. Some of our speakers aren't bilingual. In fact, most of our speakers are bilingual. And so it would be tricky to do that. But I love the challenge to do more of these things in Spanish, and I'm going to take you up on that. As for things that CWJFON and work are involved in, I imagine that you guys do things bilingually all the time. You want to just mention some of the workshops and offerings that you provide in Spanish?
Sure. And I also want to say, it's funny, I mean, I really appreciate, hi Maria, that you asked that question, because before coming into tonight, there's been a lot of conversations sort of like, during the time of COVID, you're locked in, so you're doing all the thinking all the time. And a lot of us have been talking about language justice and what that means. And one of my thoughts coming into tonight was, is there going to be someone doing interpretation or asking at the beginning if interpretation is needed? And also, is there going to be someone doing sign language? Because I think that moving forward, we all have to think about what language justice means. And we have to remember that it isn't just Spanish speakers. We have people with varied literacy levels. And so, you just have to take into consideration all these different things. So whenever we all are invited or organize panels, I think it's the next step, right? Like it's only logical for us to step into this and go, okay, we need to make sure we have someone who does sign language. We need to see if we can get an interpreter, because Aaron and I are both fluent in Spanish, but I probably wouldn't have chosen to speak in Spanish. I probably would have been more comfortable speaking in English and having a native Spanish speaker do the translating. But yeah, a majority of the work that we do in Spanish. So right now with the Worker Immigrant Relief Fund with WRF, we have an outreach coordinator, impacted community member, primary language is Spanish. And actually, for the most part, what we're doing now is only putting out information in Spanish about WRF, because one, that's the community we're reaching out to. And two, it might potentially prevent interference from people who may not be supportive of this kind of program. So it's an easy way to cut through some white noise, as it were, and to just get right to the heart of things. But yeah, we do almost all of our presentations in both Spanish and English. And Aaron can talk more about that too.
Yeah, language justice is crucial. And there's a shout out to a volunteer from last weekend who spoke Russian and was really helpful at that WRF gathering as well.
That's really cool.
There's a need for that in our courts too. We have great Spanish interpretation in the courts, but I've been in the courts when folks who speak Mexican indigenous languages were not getting their fair day in court because they could not really understand the proceeding. So it's a major issue.
Thank you for that. And I think language justice merits its own separate conversation too. We might be able to bring in some resources for that too in the rest of our notes for this event. And an interpreter is a great idea. Let me know if you know one.
There's actually a Whitman student named Alex who I believe they are working specifically on language justice issues with YSEN. So yeah, I will link you up with them afterwards. I did see one of the questions that I really wanted to just sort of check in on from Jasmine, asking, is it too hopeful to expect a pathway to citizenship from Biden rather than just a restoration of DACA? I don't think anything is too hopeful, but it's definitely going to need pressing. You know, I think that he will very quickly reinstate the ability for people to apply for DACA. But again, as we've seen, he really shies away from any form of progressive rhetoric, but that's okay. We just push harder because now he's in office. So we just we got past the goal line. Now let's just make sure we actually get into the White House. And then we just push really, really hard. Because my sort of like fantasy that I've been having and I keep talking to my poor husband about is like, okay, how am I going to get into that office with Biden? And what am I going to ask for? What are the executive orders I'm going to really focus on? And it was one about a pathway to citizenship for DACA because it's theoretically quite easy to do if you have the sort of like gumption to do it and to take it on. But it was really what Aaron brought up, which is DAPA. That was dropped a long time ago, and we need to really think and work hard at ensuring that there is a DACA-like program to protect our older community members because they've been here for a really long time. Many of them a lot longer than some of us on this video. So I think that's let's hope for the best and work hard to push for it.
And also expand, I think that I would expand DACA. I would push for expanding DACA further, as I said, to include essential workers, right? Who have such an opening right now to take care of the people who have been taking care of all of us during this crisis and who are undocumented. And also folks who are in that catch-22 situation. There was a case in Walla Walla not long ago. We did a court accompaniment for a man who grew up his whole life in Walla Walla, is married to a U.S. citizen, has U.S. citizen kids, but can't get legal status in the United States because like 15 years ago, when he was a teenager, he was deported. And he came back because his whole life was here. And so because of coming back after deportation, that makes it really almost impossible for him to get legal status, even though he's married to a US citizen. And there's a lot of people in that catch-22 situation. So expanding DACA in that direction is also key. But yeah, I think the pathway to citizenship or pathway to legal status is as hopeful as we make it. But that's going to require legislation, right? DACA can be done through administrative action, but the pathway to legal status has to happen through Congress. And right now, the prospects of that are looking better than they have, perhaps, but it's going to be a tough haul. Yeah, but it's not impossible. And Biden has said that he will put in, within his first 100 days, he will put a bill into Congress with a pathway to legalization for the undocumented people of the United States. So we will see.
I also think it's kind of important at this point to bring something up that a lot of us don't talk about, which is, I can say this because I know this to be true. I have a number of really dear friends who are DACA recipients, and they could seek an asylum claim, right? So in theory, you say to yourself as somebody who has citizenship and who's sort of sitting comfortably in a safe position, well, why don't they do that? If they have a pathway to citizenship, why don't they do that? And the reality is, applying to go through an asylum process means to relive past trauma, to perform that trauma, and to hope that somebody believes your trauma. And that's something I hadn't really processed before I had a few conversations with a few friends about this, being like, oh, well, you know, there are these other pathways, like, and that's something that's really real. I mean, would you want to walk into a new space and announce the most painful, terrifying things that have happened to you or your family, and to have to assume that the other person doesn't believe you? You have to prove that the most traumatic thing that you've lived through, that your family has lived through, was real. And then you still might be denied because it's completely discretionary. So I just think that thinking that through at the same time as you're thinking through the trajectory of like pathways to citizenship through whatever means, that they are painful processes no matter how you look at them, and some of them are more painful than others, right? So a pathway to citizenship through Daca might actually be the best course of action, because the pathway through an asylum claim is potentially much more painful. So I just, food for thought, I think.
I think you're absolutely right, and I've sat in those asylum hearings, and I know exactly what you mean about that trauma. But I also want to reiterate that the vast majority of undocumented people in the United States, for them, there is no path, right?
Yeah.
I think there's sometimes like a false idea that, you know, getting your legal status is like going to the Department of Licensing. Like it's a total pain in the butt and it costs a lot and you have to wait in line. But if you're a good person, you do it, you go wait in line, you pay your money, and eventually you get your status. That is not the case. For the vast majority of undocumented people, there is no line for them to get into. There is no path, because our pathway to legal citizenship has gotten so narrow in the past 50 years. We have really closed the legal front door on immigration, particularly from Mexico and Central America. But yeah, so just I want to make that clear, that it's not just like you have a pathway to citizenship and you decide you don't want to take it, but that, you know, most people do not have that. We have to create that.
It's funny, I look to my left, and I actually, Erin, I have your printouts on my wall, specifically talking about pathways to citizenship and like how they're nonlinear, right? And having to sort of like walk people through that thought process, because I mean, it's sort of silly to say it, because I think you and I have heard it so many times before, but who knows who's on the call and has not heard it before. When someone presents themselves at the border, they are doing it the right way. That's the legal way to do it. You are walking up to the border and presenting yourself seeking asylum or seeking refuge. They are doing it the right way. It's just that we're denying them, or we're putting them in cages, or we're shuttling them back to Mexico, where they live in really precarious situations, waiting to potentially and probably be denied anyway. So yeah, the pathways are complicated and sometimes dead ends. They're like the Winchester Mystery House. That's my favorite analogy for the immigration system. It's like the Winchester Mystery House.
Yeah, I had an immigration attorney was trying to explain something about immigration law to me, and I was like, oh, I think I get it. And he said, well, if you're understanding what I'm saying, then I'm clearly explaining it wrong. We've created such an arcane and crazy system. Leave is bugging us, Abby, to answer Chuck's question about workers going unpaid.
Where's Chuck's question? Let me look, Chuck.
Yeah.
Where are you at, buddy?
Do you know workers who don't get paid for their work?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of people who get underpaid, a lot of people who, especially, I mean, this happened before COVID, but especially now, there are tons of workers who will go, they're forced to work even when they're sick. And, you know, then the plant gets shut down because they've been caught because somebody's actually gotten sick enough that they're hospitalized and people don't get paid. There's a lot of enforced labor, and there's also, you know, there are strange dynamics also within communities, right? So there are some, I know that in some families, they, you know, they're used to having people come and clean for them and cook for them back home in Mexico. And so when they, for those particular families that I know some of them, they've gotten their papers, they have their documents, everything's in order, and they will abuse undocumented labor around their houses. And there's no shortage of that happening in all communities. But yeah, absolutely, a lot of people go unpaid for their work.
Well, thank you, friends. I think that this conversation could go deep into the night. And I hope that we get together again and continue. This is such important work that you guys are doing, and we lift up our gratitude and thanks and praise to CWJ-FON and to work, and for the work that you guys are doing. Erin and Abigail, thank you so much. And thank you, friends, for joining us tonight. This was wonderful. I hope you learned something and have pondering all of these things and are hopefully inspired to action too. So I can't wait for more conversations. So stay tuned and keep your eyes peeled for the recording of this conversation, which will go up with some answers to questions that were left unresolved. Okay. Oh, well, blessings to all of you. Thank you so much. We'll see you next time. And thanks, Haley. Yes. All right. Bye, friends.